hope you're familiar with Trevor Noah, South African comedy, very famous and dope. Got a lot of stand-up shows and runs a show in America, The Daily Show. So if you're familiar with this, you're gonna get along because we're gonna be doing a book review of his book, Born a Crime, South African Stories. The book by Trevor Noah, Born a Crime, it's one of it's now kind of one of the best stories, right?
Like, yeah, I think it's one of his best stories.
Definitely a bestseller.
Yeah.
Best-selling. Yeah. By Trevor Noah, comedian from South Africa, who was raised during apartheid as a crime. If you don't know what that means as a crime, you'll catch up because we're gonna explain on that. We're gonna be doing this on a social psychological perspective, but then literature-wise, I'll say it's an autobiography because the guy explains what happens to himself, right? Autobiography, you're explaining events like that happened in your life. He uses real characters like his mother, the friends, his dad, and the uncle, who's my favorite character, and how he survived, how apartheid was separating the societies. It's all real. It happened. That's basically how I would explain an autobiography. Then, in a psychological perspective, I find this book, I think it's a good book because it explains those theories and terms of social psychology, like social identity theory, conformity, and social facilitation. I'll explain a bit on that. On social identity theory, there's a point where it talks about the parties, Inkatha and ANC. If you're a member of ANC, you now belong to that group. You have that sense of belonging to the ANC. So anyone who's not part of ANC, like who's part of Inkatha, will be more like an enemy because he's an out group, right? That was on social identity. That's how it explains social identity for social psych and how that affected the society and how it still affects the society now, because I'm sure it still have a big effect, right? And then conformity. And conformity, like, that's when people conform to a certain norm, even if they don't know why, but they do. He mentioned, I think in his first chapter, it's like, in South Africa, everyone minds his own business until someone shouts that there's a thief. Because when someone says there's a thief, everyone's going to beat the thief. I've seen it too. Like in town, when anyone just says there's a thief, everyone's going to start beating that person. And when someone else is passing, sees people beating the person, just going to go and join, start beating the person. You'll probably find out that 75% of the people beating the person, they don't know why they're beating him. They just found someone beating, and then they...
Like mob psychology.
Mob psychology, yeah. That's how it is. That's how it explains conformity. And then it's like by that time, during apartheid, obvious, when you were a white, you're superior. When you're black, you're inferior. So just by knowing that you're white, that will improve whatever you do. You have that vibe, you have that confidence because you are white, right? And then for blacks, even if you know that kind of, even if you're not a loser, but still the fact that you're black will make you just a loser because there was nothing you could do. Like education will be given to black people for limited amount of years, right?
Okay, so the purpose of Trevor's book, I think, is to provide an account of what life was like for South Africans in general living under apartheid and living through the transition from apartheid to democracy. And more specifically, what it was like living as a so-called biracial child in a country which criminalized so-called racial mixing. The book provides a very good introductory look at the system of apartheid, what its effects were like for human beings on the ground, and it also provides an account of the end of apartheid and the transition from apartheid to democracy and what was involved in there. The Inkatha, as my colleague has mentioned, the Inkatha and the ANC violence and whatnot. The target audience for this book, I would say, it seems to be like Trevor is focusing more on a foreign audience with not much background knowledge about apartheid. My impression of this was sort of gotten from, he uses lots of sort of American idioms, like he uses Tesco and to describe a South African mall audience. I think because he provides such a nice, thorough, basic overview of what apartheid involved, it does seem to be like it's aimed at the so-called born-free generation, people born after the end of apartheid who might not have directly experienced the system itself. Noah takes us through his formative years from toddler to young adulthood. He does this in a series of episodes, a series of anecdotes from his childhood, which he prefaces with a bit of info as to the context. So, for example, I think just before the first chapter, he speaks about apartheid's divide and rule policy, which was quite central to how apartheid worked, which essentially separated the black majority into various language groups so that they couldn't unite against white minority rule. The book itself takes us from Trevor Noah's, I mentioned it from his... Okay, so the book takes us through the circumstances of Trevor's birth, that he was born to a Xhosa mother and a Swiss-German father, which was in itself an illegal act at the time. So, an important part of Noah's childhood that he speaks about in the book was not being able to hang out with other children in the neighborhood because his family actually had to hide him from the authorities so that they wouldn't take him away for being a product of racial miscegenation. This continued until around the end of apartheid when Trevor was around 9. After that, Trevor takes us through his adolescence, gives us a few anecdotes about sort of feeling around in the whole love game for the first time. He takes us into his young adulthood. And I think the story probably culminates in his mother being shot in the head by her abusive husband. Yeah.
Okay, so just to give like a recap, so social identity talks about like how people belong to groups and how people gravitate towards groups that exude like the same characteristics. So like you drift towards people either because of race or because of sex or like your sex or because of like your social standing. So Trevor's book like brings out how he didn't necessarily belong to a certain group because being mixed was a crime when around the time that he grew up. So he didn't belong to the black race or he didn't belong to the white race, and that gave him like he felt alienated because of that. From both sides.
And from colored people as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and because of like with colored people, he said one of the stories was that he grew up in a town where it was largely a colored town, and so like being there, he didn't belong because like he was colored, but then he wasn't colored in his personality. So like he was either too black or too white. He never like fit in. So that gave him problems because he just felt like an outcast, and so it just brings out how like the social identity theory, like it's very what can I say? It has an emphasis on how people grow up, because you want to feel like you belong somewhere, but like if you don't belong, it gives you like you start to feel depressed, you start to feel like you don't belong, and it's just
it's meaningless.
It's meaningless.
And
yeah.
he really spoke about what he instead found meaningful in his life and so on. You know, the good points and the bad, both presented in the book.
Yeah.
It kind of helped him though. And there's a point when he said they were stealing chocolates.
Oh yeah.
And then they ran away.
Oh, that helped.
So when the cameras, they'll see a black person, a white person, they look at him, he's not white, he's not
white.
black either.
Yeah. So I guess it had
That's
like advantages and disadvantages as well. I mean, like, I remember reading a bit about how you could elevate yourself, like your color could elevate you. So like, if you pressed your hair and you were like colored but you had curly hair, if you pressed it and you looked like your skin was light enough, you could go to the offices and you could change your documents and you could become white.
Mhm.
And like if like white people had like a child who was who passed off as being colored, they had to make a choice of whether they had to move to the colored community or like whether you give your child away. Like, I think it was very like stressful times. You just had to, like, you were constantly made aware of the fact that your color mattered as to how people positioned you in society. And that's like, that's scary. Yeah.
So, in the opening chapters of his book, Trevor Noah explores the grisly tactics the apartheid regime also used to prevent a unified South Africa and continue their own survival. Since whites were a minority group, the government relied on spreading fear and tyranny among the black community to enforce their delusion of control. The fear cast a dark cloud of conflict and oppression over South Africa by blending racism, misogyny, and poverty into the culture of all people under the flag. Everyone suffered. Violence, murder, and subterfuge tore families apart, and a unified South Africa seemed to be impossible. But in fact, it was very possible, which is exactly why Trevor Noah was born a crime. Because amidst this ocean of chaos, colored people were living proof that there was love between these races, and that a loving, unified South Africa with mixed-race families and none of this racial differentiation was very possible. So that automatically made both Trevor, other colored people, and people like his mother enemies of the state, which is also very much explored in the book, as she would often have to hide herself in the same shot. And Trevor Noah's mom, who, as the book reveals, is a very, very strong woman and a shining example of what true feminism is. The Zulus, on the other hand, were a warrior race, sporting great feats of achievement. Together, they might have brought considerable force to bear on the tyranny of their government. Instead, Trevor describes how they tear at each other's throats, with violence equaling the government in its malice. So in a world where blacks would spy on their neighbor and report it to a white government, no one could be trusted, and hope was very scarce. So in this regard, the church was used as a unifying force for good. Trevor describes the church as the father figure for households that lacked a strong father. So, for example, and taught Trevor the important lessons one usually learns from a father. For example, Trevor adores the strength of Samson in the Bible, and it became an ideal for a young boy. He thought he was a badass, and as all psychologists worth their salt know, those figures in a young person's life are essential to how they act as an adult. Besides this, the church also acted as a buttress against the suffering of the community as a whole by being a safe and hopeful place. Trevor often described how churches, each church would have its own racial demographic, but at the same time, each church also brought something different to the table in terms of content. The analytical church, for example, was white church, and was a very boring slug, if short slug, through the scriptures, whereas something like Jubilee churches or mixed-race churches would be a lot more lively and bring back the soul of the community. This united them temporarily, but once again, it was very desperately needed in this time.
Now, this guy says that there's intimacy, passion, and commitment, which is liking, infatuation, and anti-love. So applying this to to Trevor's parents. So the book says they lived in the same corridor, whereby Trevor's father lived further off. So now what happened was they got into a relationship, fine, and it was a romantic relationship, meaning it had passion and it had intimacy. So now what I noticed is that they moved on from a romantic relationship to a compassionate relationship, because in the beginning Trevor's father did not want a child, and then she managed to convince him to have one. So it does not only involve passion and intimacy, but it's intimacy and commitment. So it shows that he's actually committed into doing this. All right. Okay. Of commitment is when he used to walk with them in public, and then when the police come, they act like they don't know each other. So it still shows that he actually wants to be there. So it's still compassionate love. But now what I also noticed, they actually move on to empty love, because at the end of the day, you find out that the guy becomes abusive. So now there's no passion, there's no intimacy. But the fact that he is still there with them, it means that he is still committed. However, there is no love. So see how they move from romantic love, compassionate love, and then down to empty love. So it's also a general idea that love is not something with one face. So you can move from romantic love to another form, to another form, to another form. Doesn't mean that if you're in a relationship, you will just be in one state for the rest of your life. So yeah, that's what I've found out.
Okay. So, in conclusion, I think it's worth talking about the value the book has and who you would recommend it for, who would find value in reading this book. And I think, personally, anyone who wants a more true lens of what it was like on the ground in South Africa during the apartheid regime will benefit greatly from reading Trevor's book. Because it not only shows the realities he had to face, but it shows how those realities shaped him as a person. But also, it is a hopeful story of how he transcended it, and his success internationally is proof of that.